Good morning, everyone. Very excited to talk to you this morning with an esteemed panel of subject matter experts on how the concept of money is evolving. In the region of Southern Africa, money has evolved tremendously over the last few centuries, from ostrich shell beads and assegai spear tips in the 16th and 17th centuries, to the Rex dollar, which was a silver-backed money, and the gold standard in the 17th and 18th centuries, to the pound sterling and the South African pound in the 18th and early 19th centuries, to the creation and the introduction of the rand in 1961. The only constant in the world of money is change. Before the 17th century, there were no printed banknotes in Southern Africa because, well, there were no printing presses here. Before the South African Reserve Bank was created in 1921, there were only privately issued banknotes in circulation, known as an era of free banking. And these banknotes were claims to gold. For the first 40 years of its existence, from 1921 to 1961, the SARB managed a foreign monetary standard, that of the South African pound. As society and its technologies change, so too does the concept of money change with it. Despite all this change over the centuries, the functions of money and payments remain the same. Money acts as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. A payments company in the world of physical money, aka meaning banknotes or gold specie, were simply courier companies. Wells Fargo and American Express are two great examples. A G4S cash and transit vehicle is a good modern example of a business affecting physical payments. As money has become increasingly digitized in the last few decades, in particular since 1971, there's less reliance on the physical movement of money, but more on the electronic movement of money. Recent data I took a look at shows that north of 95% of all currency in circulation are electronic banknotes, electronic money and bank deposits. PASA was formally established in 1996 and empowered by the SARB as the payment system management body in 1999. PASA defines a payment as the payer's transfer of a monetary claim on a party acceptable to the payee. A monetary claim, of course, is an IOU of money. It's a debt, it's a liability. Section 5 of the National Payment System Act of 1998 defines money as a coin or a banknote issued by the Reserve Bank. Simply, a payment in the existing payment landscape is the movement of a debt or a liability on a commercial bank or a central bank's balance sheet between different entities. This naturally introduces systemic risks, as a payment entails the literal movement of debts between entities. The concept of systemic risk in an arrangement such as this always looms large. The NPS Act does not consider the possibility, and this is where I guess the rubber meets the road of the conversation that we're going to explore today. The NPS Act does not consider the possibility of a digital bearer instrument, such as an electronic gold coin, if one can fathom that has no settlement or counterparty risk, which is also essentially inseparable from the internet itself. The innovation of something like Bitcoin now makes this possible, a digital bearer instrument. But technologies like Bitcoin are also networks and technology systems that act as open source payment rails, on top of which traditional or existing values can also travel. Things like CBDCs, stable coins, or even traditional securities. While these technology systems they're native to the Internet Protocol stack, things like the World Wide Web Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, or the TCP/IP protocol. What does this mean for a body of regulations that have been optimized and crafted in an era of analog money? What does it mean for the Reserve Bank that has historically been technology neutral? When the concept of money and payments becomes an inseparable part of using the internet, how does one keep treating these as separate activities? These innovations introduce so many more questions than it produces answers at this stage, because it's so early in this new innovation. But with us on the panel today, we have subject matter experts who can help us unpack some of these big ideas. With us, we have Farzam Ehsani, who's the founder and CEO of VALR.com, a crypto asset exchange serving South African customers. Hi, Farzam. We also have Co-Pierre George, who's Associate Professor at the University of Cape Town and holds the South African Reserve Bank Research Chair in Financial Stability Studies. Hi, Co-Pierre.
Good morning, everyone.
And thirdly, but not least, is Herco Steyn, who's the Acting Divisional Head of FinTech in the Executive Management Department of the SARB. Hi, Herco.
Hi,
Gentlemen,
morning.
good morning. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. Really looking forward to this conversation. Herco, I think, let me start with you. How does one even begin as a central bank to bring such potentially fundamental shifts in the concept of money and payments that is also so global in nature into existing regulatory frameworks that vary so dramatically and are quite idiosyncratic and based on local customs, norms, and legal frameworks? Seems like an extraordinarily complex role to play to balance the trade-offs between the risks and the benefits to broader society. What are your thoughts on this, Herco?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And I'll maybe just make a few kind of broad comments and then we'll get into the thick of it. So, and again, it's a wonderful pleasure and a privilege to be here. So thanks so much. I'd just like to touch on two really interesting points you made. I think firstly around the comment of as society and its technology changes, so does the concept of money. And I think this topic is absolutely fascinating. And I think without rehashing some well-recorded discussions around what is money, I would like to highlight that in a discussion on how the concept of money, let alone money itself, is evolving, we cannot fully get away from the fundamental question or questions around what is money and who has the right to issue it. So firstly, I think in my view, at the very heart of the issue is the potential tension between public and private forms of money, or phrased differently, between money issued by the central bank and all other forms aspiring to function as money, but which are not issued by the central bank. So in turn, I think this prompts a deeper philosophical consideration of whether we, as a society, to your earlier point, view money as a social or legal construct, or both, or neither for that matter. So if we view money as a legal construct, the definition of money is quite narrow, as you've highlighted. Money is legal tender, which is defined as banknotes and coin issued by the SARB, to your earlier point. However, if we view money as a social construct along the lines of money is as money does from a practical perspective, then potentially any instrument that performs the three functions of money you've highlighted, of serving as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account, may be considered to be money from a practical or social perspective, irrespective of whether it's recognized as such in law or not. So I think this loops back nicely to your point around the partial definition of a payment, which I find very interesting, which is the transfer of a monetary claim on a party, but then crucially with the qualification acceptable to the payee. Thus again highlighting that for something to function as a payment instrument, the terms simply need to be agreed by the transacting parties. Then I think a further key consideration in the context of this session is articulating the key implications of the ongoing digitalization of payments and money. So how do we think about money that purely exists potentially in the digital realm? Then finally, and I'll conclude with this, from a legal and a regulatory perspective, the existing regulatory framework largely developed around focusing regulation on some type of intermediary, whether it's a bank payments operator or otherwise. But I think what is interesting is two of the probably strongest value propositions of financial innovations, such as DLT or distributed ledger technology, are based on decentralization and disintermediation. And I think this poses a fundamental challenge in terms of reconciling legacy legal and regulatory frameworks with emerging innovations, and also perhaps just noting that to a very large extent, the existing framework we have in South Africa, and it's not unique to South Africa, is very much evolved around the notion of physical money kind of moving around. And if we get into the exchange control issue, we might also touch on moving across physical borders. And I think the digital nature of kind of innovation poses some interesting questions on that. But let me stop there. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks, Herco. Very interesting. Co-Pierre, I want to come to you now. I guess if we consider Herco's definition of what money is, a legal construct, something that is issued by the South African Reserve Bank, I guess an area of innovation in the blockchain space and the landscape is these concepts of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs or stablecoins. It seems to me that those concepts still fit this definition of moving monetary claims. The only difference is the technology in which these units are ledgered, and the rails through which these currencies are therefore transferred between different entities. What are your thoughts? I know you've done some work on lot of work on CBDCs and stablecoins, and you have a perspective that is quite interesting. In the US, we've seen stablecoins be very popular, where you have these unregulated, essentially, entities to a large extent creating tokens that are backed by traditional dollars and bank accounts. You are ever concerned at the proliferation of that model and believe that CBDCs are a better model and approach that should be rolled out? Give us your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think we're at a time of almost unprecedented payment systems modernization. I think we haven't seen this kind of a fundamental overhaul of our payments infrastructure and really the core financial infrastructure in probably 50 years. Since we introduced electronic payments, I don't think we've seen anything like what we see now. So the question that is chief on my mind is, how do we design this infrastructure? Do we want to build the internet, or do we want to build Facebook? And I think that's the choice that is in front of us, and that's a choice that people who build infrastructure technology always face. So the situation at the moment is that we have private crypto assets which are not really used for payments. They're mostly a store of value. Whether it's a store or whether it's just pure speculation, that's a different debate. But this idea that was around in 2018, 2017, that this would become a ubiquitous means of payment, that just hasn't realized. There's still some places you can pay with crypto. I think if you go on Auto Trader, you can get a Lambo for crypto in good fashion and style. But pretty much everywhere beyond that, you always have to go through some form of exchange to do that. So I think that idea hasn't really caught on. What has caught on was the move of Facebook to create Libra as a global stablecoin, as a global means of payment, which has raised immediate concerns from regulators all over the world, unanimously across the political spectrum, for a variety of reasons. I think the biggest reason is that the central banks would lose control over a key part of the infrastructure in this world of private stablecoins. What Libra and all these stablecoins, so stablecoin is just usually a digital token based on a blockchain that is pegged one-to-one with some currency or currency basket. So it's either a USD stablecoin, then it's pegged to US dollar. There's a Rand stablecoin, but I don't think it's widely used. Libra was supposed to be pegged to a basket of currencies. The challenge with all these stablecoins is, where do you put the money? If it's stable, it needs to go into a perfectly stable instrument. And the only perfectly safe, perfectly stable instrument is the central bank facilities. Bank deposits are not insured, or at least most of them aren't. In South Africa, we don't even have deposit insurance yet. So our deposits aren't insured. So bank deposits aren't safe. So what these new companies want is they want access to the central bank facilities. So the question then becomes, if there's a demand for these kind of services, and I believe there is, because the digital economy has been outgrowing the real economy for the past 10 years. And there is a need to create a native payment system for the digital economy. And we don't have that yet. Question is, do you want to have private companies, unregulated entities, because they're not regulated like a bank, even though by my reading of the Banks Act, if you issue a stable coin, you would need a banking license. And there's already companies in South Africa in blatant violation of the Banks Act because they offer access to stable coins. So if you do that, then why do you want to accept this sort of walled garden system where every bank, every company issuing these stable coins builds their own little ecosystem? Why not create a public infrastructure where data can be moved? When you think about financial inclusion, that's one of the big drivers for CBDC, is to say, well, we want to enable users that are formerly in the informal economy to actually create payments histories so that they can get access to credit. If you allow this payments history to be captured on the balance sheet of private entities as opposed to the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, they will not be able to move this data around. That's exactly where the competition between these stablecoins comes in. So I think it's really important to make clear what the role of the state is in such a system, and it should be an enabling role that helps to make all these different systems interoperable. so that we don't have the enclosure of data, that we don't have competition through capture of data. And I think that is the way that we will see forward. At the moment, when you look at the SEC, they have already come out to say, Gary Gensler, that in his opinion, every coin is every ICO is a security, which means he will come after the exchanges, because every exchange lists securities that are unregulated. So the first one that should fall are the exchanges. I'm really keen to hear Farzam's thoughts on whether this is something that keeps you up at night, that specter of, the SEC knocking at your door. And we've seen this in China. They've cracked down on private crypto as hard as anyone could. So I think we will see the next 2 years or so sweeping regulation of these stable coins. And if I read the mood at the G20 right, then it's just going to be a ban on stable coins, or only by banking institutions, issued only by banks, basically, because of all the risks that they carry for financial stability.
No, thanks for your thoughts on that, Co-Pierre. So, I mean, what I'm kind of taking away from the conversation is that there's a really big innovation in having these open source, essentially, databases and technologies that entities around the world are able to communicate through. Now, it's obviously a very difficult thing as private industry and entities to try and spin something like that up. Farzam, I know, moving across to you, I know that you were a blockchain lead at a commercial bank formerly, and you did a lot of work on you published a paper called The Advent of Crypto Banking in 2016, where you unpacked a lot of these issues. And subsequent to that, of course, you left to found VALR.com, which is a crypto assets exchange. As Co-Pierre's mentioned, you might be in the firing line with a lot of these assets being listed and traded on your platform. What are your thoughts around how this evolves? Do you think regulation comes before the innovation? How do you see this all playing out?
Yeah, great questions, and lovely to hear the other guys talk. So a lot of topics here. Maybe just to answer the topic of regulation and being an exchange, and then I'll give some thoughts on what Co-Pierre said and kind of the future of money and the evolving nature of money. So as we know, Chris, the innovation has already happened, right? So it's not about which one first. Innovation has already happened. Crypto has been around for a very long time. I was looking back at some of my notes from when I was at the bank, and I was looking at what the total market cap of all cryptocurrencies were at the time and where we're standing right now. And that was about 5 years ago. At the time, my presentation had $12 billion as the total value of all crypto in the world. Today, it's sitting close to 2 trillion. So we're talking about an increase of 150x. And for those that have trouble with percentages, 150x is close to 15,000% over the last 5 years. Okay, so we're talking about a trend that is almost unstoppable, and its momentum is picking up rapidly every single day. We're obviously talking about the decentralized cryptocurrencies. A lot of the people in central banks like to talk about these currencies as private cryptocurrencies. I view them as actually the opposite of private cryptocurrencies. They're public, they're for the world to use. They have nothing private really about them. So and then, the regulations are coming up. As VALR.com, we've made it very clear from the get-go, before we actually even opened our doors, we were sitting down with the SARB and the other regulators to say, listen, this is what we want to do. Are there any issues? Do we need to get licensed? Can you license us? Can you regulate us? And the response that was always coming back was, we have no framework within which to regulate you. And then the next question was, well, shall we wait or can we proceed? Because there are others that have proceeded. And the answer was, please proceed. And, as regulations come up, then they will be applicable. So we've anticipated what the regulations would be. We KYC all of our customers. We, to the best of our abilities, we do not list securities, right? And so also there are definitions about what a security is, and there's a lot of debate, and there's a lot of courts kind of precedents about what a security is in the US and other places. So we're very open, we are very communicative with the regulators, and we have every intention of complying. So as regulations come up, we will comply. So it's as simple as that. So am I up at night worried about this? No. And the reason is that the intent is there. We've got intent to comply. We communicate that intent. I believe in a just world, and I believe that our institutions in South Africa can be just. And so I think we'll get to a more mature stage after a while, but this is kind of part of the process and part of the path and the journey. So a couple of things to note, though, because this topic of this panel is the evolution of money, and I really loved your introductory remarks. It's important to note that money and the conception of money changes so dramatically, to your point, Chris. So, you know, and Co-Pierre, and I've got a lot of love for Co-Pierre, and we have lots of nice debates. But, you know, Co-Pierre made the statement right now that, you know, central bank issued currencies are the most stable and the most safe. And yes, that's in relation to their own currency, right? But we also know that currencies that have been issued by central parties in history, it's just a matter of time before they become unstable and unsafe. Not because, you know, someone can't pay them back or redeem those liabilities, because the fact of the matter is they can't pay that back right now. The liability of a 100 Rand note from the central bank, I have asked, and I've told this story before. I've been to the central bank and I said, this 100 Rand is a liability, is it not? And the answer is yes. I said, I'd like to redeem it. And the answer that comes back is a little bit of, you know, well, we assure you of the confidence of our financial system. So it's not like there's anything backing up our note. So the idea of market risk is very, very big for currencies that are based on the nation state or a particular euro right now. Just as it is right now with cryptocurrencies, by the way. I'm not saying that Bitcoin is way more volatile at the moment. We know that. But what I am saying is that things evolve. And to think that the US dollar will stay stable throughout our lifetimes, I think is a fallacy. And I think that what we call stable coins right now will be the epitome of unstable coins in due course, right? Because the underlying of the dollar or the fiat will start hitting some headwinds, and then we'll start seeing some turmoil, and that will obviously affect the tokens that represent it. So I think that we are moving to a standard, to Co-Pierre's point, again, that is not about a private institution or a stable coin that's a private company that issues it, but we're looking to open standards. And timing is critical, right? The internet started in the 1960s. TCP/IP, you mentioned it just now, Chris. That was invented in 1983. Anybody listening to this this panel right now probably didn't start using an email or had heard about it until like the mid to late 90s, you know, and let alone all the other stuff that's come out of the internet. So we're still in the very early stages of crypto. And I think the adoption is still very, very early. And I think what we see in history is when a society adopts value, that's when it really starts to become a bit more stable, because there is a consensus around that value. Right now with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, there's no consensus. We're in that process of discovering the value. So it cannot be stable by definition. If it were stable, it would not be what it claims to be. So we're in this process, and it's a very exciting one to be a part of.
So you're essentially saying you're dealing with what are startup monetary technologies and expect them to be volatile because it's so early. Co-Pierre, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few. Tulips had a 150x increase as well before they plummeted. The 150x increase doesn't tell you anything about the fundamental value. The thing that I will concede, and Farzam and I had these discussions throughout the years, is that the interest in crypto from regulated entities has increased faster than regulators have tried to shut it down. So actually the latest ban in China, if you are into crypto, I think must have been very encouraging, because China cracked down really hard on the legal validity of crypto transactions, basically declaring them null and void. And Bitcoin still only budged 5%. It's more closely correlated with Nasdaq or with any traditional stock index than with this Chinese crackdown. The risk that I see first and foremost is now that if the SEC decides that Bitcoin, Ethereum, all of these things are securities, they will be able to find all the issuers of these securities. That means they will need cash, because they need to settle with the SEC, and the SEC accepts settlement in fiat only. So at every exchange, everywhere around the world, you will see the same run for the exit, because everybody suddenly needs fiat to settle this. So this is very much similar to a systemic bank run. And I think there is a real risk at the moment that if the SEC doesn't manage their process very carefully, that we will see this kind of panic selling in anticipation of settlements with the SEC. So I think it's a real risk that we need to acknowledge, but it doesn't really solve the issue of what kind of infrastructure do we want to build. The internet was, as Farzam said, was invented in 1969 at UCLA, but the first commercial use of the internet was only allowed in 1994 when NSFNet, the then operator, accepted that commercial operations are allowed on the internet, and 5 years later we had a huge bubble that burst in the dot-com bust. So this idea that the government and DARPANet, it was really the embodiment. This came out of the Department of Defense research originally. The government played a very enabling role in the creation of the internet to make sure that the technology is ready, that we have all these standards, that we have all the necessary building blocks to ensure that it's safe, that it's stable, that it's resilient, that it's, all the things that we want of our infrastructure. And we don't have that yet with crypto or with central bank digital currencies. I think we are seeing it, but this is only the beginning. And 80 central banks around the world are looking into CBDCs. China has already issued one. So this is not about hypotheticals. This is happening. The Euro area has committed to the digital Euro project, which sees an implementation phase over the next 2 years with an evaluation whether they want to roll it out afterwards. So this is something that we are already seeing, and I think it's a very exciting development.
Thanks, Co-Pierre. So, Herco, keen to hear your thoughts on Farzam's comments. I know that the South African Reserve Bank and other regulatory stakeholders have been extremely proactive in setting up an environment like the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group, which is in essence a response to market demands where customers, consumers, people starting businesses are looking for some kind of regulatory framework. So that's been great, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on Farzam's comments as well.
Sure, thanks very much, Chris. So I suppose maybe just a quick comment on Farzam's point around kind of private versus public crypto. So fully agree, kind of the blockchain might be public, but I think the distinction that I would like to make is between kind of public and private money, or essentially to my earlier point around kind of money issued by the central bank versus all kind of money-like type instruments issued by non-central banks, essentially. And I think this is where the BIS, especially Benoit Cura, he's quite vocal in the media and he makes many speeches on the matter. So, and I think that's something that we very much subscribe to, is the kind of fundamental point of departure that money is a public good and should ideally be provided by kind of the public sector, and in this case, the central bank, and in the South African context, the SARB. So I think in the context of this discussion, it is central banks have to retain their ability to deliver on their mandates as it relates to price and financial stability, or monetary and financial stability. And I think this is where the infrastructure kind of point that Co-Pierre keeps making comes in. And I suppose I find Farzam's points around kind of, so Lucas, a stablecoin pegged one-to-one to a fiat currency, if that, so I agree, obviously the exchange rate of fiat or sovereign currencies fluctuate. I suppose if at any stage the stablecoin, which by extension would mean the sovereign kind of currency, would be more volatile than a crypto, and perhaps that's not fully what Farzam is saying, but I simply can't see that happening for kind of I suppose unpegged crypto assets. And then maybe just, and I'm sure Farzam's got numerous responses to that. So maybe just on the work of the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group, we've set up a kind of a cross-functional crypto assets regulatory working group. And we have come up with a paper, very happy to talk to that briefly, perhaps in the context of this discussion. And I think it's kind of migrating towards stablecoins. Noting that we're running out of time, the paper essentially addresses the three most kind of pertinent or top of mind or most pressing issues in need of regulatory clarity. That is around AML-CFT. That work is being driven and owned through an ongoing process by the Financial Intelligence Center. Secondly, around consumer protection, advice, intermediary services, etc. That work is being driven by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. And then thirdly, we've got this really interesting mixing oil and water kind of scenario with crypto and exchange control regulations. And that work is also ongoing and will require amendments to the existing exchange control regulations, which I think this year is, 60 years old. And then maybe just looking slightly ahead, I think the next kind of topic on the horizon is we're very much looking to Basel and the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision for the revised or for kind of standards that will come out in terms of the kind of prudential requirements for prudentially regulated institutions, exposures to crypto assets. The SARB in South Africa well represented on those working groups, etc. So for the most part, we will transpose what comes out of Basel into the domestic banking and relevant regulatory frameworks. And then I think kind of slightly more medium to long term is kind of this issue around how to regulate stablecoins. And I think Co-Pierre's point around does kind of stablecoin issuance contravene the Banks Act? I'm not a legal expert, but I think that's a wonderful kind of point to kind of explore, etc. And it again comes back to the legal definition of money, what constitutes a deposit, etc. So, but I think let me stop there in the interest of time. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks, Herco. I mean, one thing that's been fascinating to me in the last few weeks is it's a small nation, but the nation of El Salvador classified Bitcoin as legal tender in their country. So when you now read the Currency and Exchanges Manual, for example, Bitcoin should technically be legally deemed a foreign currency in South Africa. And now suddenly these lines between public and private currencies also become blurred and all weird and confusing. But Faz, I want to hear what you think about that and some of the other thoughts and points that have come out.
Yeah, a couple of points. So just about the tulip bubble, I think it's important to note that bubbles generally pop once, right? But crypto has gone in cycles, and I think it will continue doing that. Regarding Herco's thoughts about, if I'm saying fiat currency will become more volatile than crypto, let me contextualize my answer before I give it, which is what we saw in the dot-com bubble, where we saw a whole bunch of companies that went flat. I think will happen still with crypto. I think there are a lot of cryptocurrencies that will be totally worthless. Right? Totally worthless. And I think the market will decide which cryptocurrencies those are. But I think just like the internet, some of the most valuable assets that exist today in the world are based on that technology, the internet, that, those were the shining lights that came and provided so much value to the world. And I think we're still in that process with crypto where I think, I cannot say whether it's going to be Bitcoin or it's going to be Ethereum or any other crypto that's going to succeed. I really don't know. But what I do strongly believe is that our next form of money as humanity is going to be based on crypto. It's a much more, I think, a much more advanced and useful technology to be using as money. And I don't think it's going to be based on the nation state anymore. So to Herco's point, and this might sound really strange, I think it's not just an idea. I think it's inevitable that every single national currency is going to become much more volatile than whatever that decentralized currency of the world is going to be in some way or form. And I'm not saying this as a hypothesis. I'm just saying if you look at history, history has tons and tons of examples of exactly this. And the last point I'll say is that, especially today, we have this conception that money should be issued by the state. This is a very, very new concept in the history of humanity. And to be honest with you, we're in the midst of an experiment. The experiment is not crypto. The experiment is fiat right now. The big fiat experiment, which is really started from 1971 being unbacked by gold. It's very, very young. I'm not talking about crypto again. I'm talking about fiat, 50 years old, right? So I think that experiment, we will see kind of where it goes. But the point is that the world is moving, identities are moving. We kind of think about things in silo. But the fact of the matter is that we have all these confluencing factors affecting the world. The nation state is an entity whose heyday was in the past. We're becoming a more globalized society. We need to find new ways of governance that are transnational. We need to find new monies that are transnational. So while we're used to this idea of a central bank issuing currency, this is only like a blink of an eye in history over the last 100 years or so, right? And I think previous to that, we had things that were not issued centrally, like gold, that were verified by central authorities to say this is worth X amount of grams of gold. But we have that verification now in the form of technology and what we call nodes of a blockchain. So that usefulness, obviously, of that stamp is also faded away. So I don't know where the world is going, but I know for sure that it will resemble nothing like it does today.
Thanks, Faz. It does also seem that there may be something of a worldview clash at play in a sense. But I think at the end of the day, as with anything, consumers are sovereign and make decisions in a marketplace. And that really will lead all of us to, make decisions down the road. We've only got like 7 minutes left. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to give everybody a closing remark, and I haven't seen any questions coming through. But Co-Pierre, maybe some, closing thoughts from your side.
I think the biggest decision we have to take is which way we want to design the digital economy. It will become much more important. And Farzam's point about a global economy, I think that applies to the digital economy. I don't think it really applies to the physical economy. And I think the challenge we have is that economic activity very often still follows geographic boundaries. And that's not necessarily the state, but it's located in Gauteng or in Cape Town. So if you want to manage the business cycle, which you really want to do, because otherwise, we've seen in the past what happens if central banks can't manage the business cycle. So if you want to manage the business cycle, you can't have completely free movement of funds around, simply because then it's impossible to do monetary policy that targets the right area of physical activity. Now, in the digital space, this becomes a fundamental challenge. And I think China has understood this, which is why they have been leading the way on this public infrastructure that they have been building and rolling out. So I think this is the debate that we need to engage with. And there's a lot of sort of smoke and mirrors about private crypto versus public infrastructure. I think the key question is how do we design the digital economy? Who do we allow to enclose and capture data that is being created as a new asset class? And I think if you look at data, 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years. That statement has been true for 30 years. So this is by far, with AI and machine learning, this is the world's most valuable asset class. It's increasing in size and value constantly. And we need to decide, how do we assign property rights in that new digital economy? And for that, it really matters who we allow to enclose the data. At the moment, we have accepted that Facebook, Google, Amazon, they are allowed to enclose our data. But that's not an inevitable situation. We can change that. And I think one of the key aspects of changing that is to create an infrastructure that allows fair competition of banks with other entities that service the digital economy better than what banks have been doing so far. Because of the high cost of payments that we have, lots of digital business models just don't function. So I think we're seeing this change. And it's just a matter of whether we think that central banks as a 353-year-old institution, not 100, but like Riksbank is 1668, I think.
That's the exception.
Whether they are the right institution to do that, or whether it's largely unregulated tech companies. And I think that is where our ideological debates will happen. At the moment, the creation of money is not by regulated financial institutions as it was in the past, which I'm perfectly fine with. We have that for a long time and it works successfully, but now it's unregulated entities. And I think this is where I have a problem, not so much with a small fintech or a bank issuing this, but with Facebook or with Google or Amazon doing that, because that is a threat to global financial stability.
Boz, do you have any closing comments? We have 3 minutes. It seems to me like there are a lot of areas of agreement in this conversation. the solution of the asset and the value unit that ultimately wins out. Clearly, not everybody's on the same page, but that's the marketplace. Farzam, any thoughts?
Just a couple. So first of all, I think it's important to know when we talk about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, we're talking about a different form factor of fiat currency, right? We have physical notes and coins, we have digital, and now we will have crypto, right? But it's just a different form factor. Monetary policy stays the same. The ability to expand and contract monetary supply stays the same, et cetera, right? So it's important to know, because a lot of people kind of equate, oh, it's crypto, so it's this new thing. No, it's not new. It's just a new form factor, a new technology that you're using, right? Whereas decentralized cryptocurrencies are a completely new asset class. Now, let me also just conclude by saying, I don't look forward to a world where we have tremendous volatility in the US dollar. I don't think that will be a world that will be like stable, right? The world will go through a lot of turmoil. So that's not what I'm saying. And I'm not even trying to propagate or propose that crypto is the future. I'm just saying, from my reading of history, this is what I see happening, for better or worse. And so I think we need to kind of look at what those possibilities are. Many people in the traditional space, I feel, get stuck without even considering the possibilities of a world without the US dollar. I think that is dangerous.
Thanks for your thoughts, Farzam. Herco, we've got a minute. If I can ask you for some concluding remarks.
100%. Thanks, Chris. So so I suppose, again, if we kind of think about one or the other, and I think that's probably the point I would like to make, kind of public versus private money, as we've discussed today. I probably kind of cannot see, I suppose, private money winning out over publicly issued money. But what I think something that has changed over the last 5 or 10 years, since kind of 2008 and the white paper, etc., is I think where initially the thinking was very much around kind of a parallel system, separate system, etc., almost like kind of around the idea of a crypto anarchist, etc. I think that's very much kind of that narrative, I think, has very much shifted over the last few years. And I think the focus now, especially in the context of CBDC, kind of moving from retail, wholesale, multi-currency, multilateral CBDC, I think there are kind of touch points among many of the themes, etc. And I think the conversation is very much has shifted from kind of separate systems to how can it potentially be integrated and kind of synthesized. So I suppose I kind of see it on a bit of a continuum rather than kind of fully one or fully the other. And I think kind of the mix of that setup will probably play out over the next decade or so. Thanks very, very much, Chris.
Thanks, Herco. What a great point, I think, to finish this conversation on. Thanks, James, for your time this morning. Great conversation.
Thank you.
It's 9:45, and look forward to speaking to you all again soon, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Cheers. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.